Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. I know that there are those who will consider this to be stirring the pot, but the truth of the matter is, if something needs to be said, it needs to be said. Recently, there was an interview with an actor whose name you may not know, but whose face you probably do, Djimon Hounsou. You've probably seen him in movies like Gladiator and Amistad, and what he was doing was saying that financially he's been struggling. Apparently, he just hasn't been getting paid right, despite the fact that he's been in the business for 3 decades and had a couple of Academy Award nominations. In the interview, he said, "I've come up in the business with some people who are absolutely well off and have very little of my accolades. So I feel cheated, tremendously cheated in terms of finances and in terms of the workload as well. I still have to prove why I need to get paid. They always come at me with a complete lowball. We only have this much for the role, but we love you so much and we really think you can bring so much." That's what he was saying about the money that he's been getting for the last 30 years. He also name-dropped Viola Davis when he was talking about why he thinks he's not getting paid right, basically to say, I'm not alone in all this. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is we have a lot of folks, in this case tethers, who constantly try to claim that they're doing better than FBA, which is largely an urban myth put forward by conservatives. And the ones you see who got somewhere only got there because of the opportunities we made available to them. That's the untold story of their quote-unquote success. But of course, if you're not able to actually see what somebody's finances are, you don't really know what they're holding. They could actually be doing very poorly, but trying to fake it until they make it. But for a lot of them, they just don't make it. I'm sure that everyone's more than excruciatingly aware of my disdain for entertainment in general, and I don't know Djimon Hounsou well enough to praise him or condemn him. But the point that I'm making is, Djimon Hounsou's situation happens to be emblematic of a far larger, far deeper problem that the immigrant community is just not talking about. If they really had so much on the ball, they would have made it big at home and then not be having these problems. It's been 70 years since those African countries had their revolutions, and things seem to be worse there now than they were before. What happened? No unity, no loyalty, and no honesty. That's what happened. You can't run from yourself. Whatever your faults, shortcomings, and failures are, you're going to take them with you wherever you go. Djimon Hounsou's problem, I think, is that he can't speak English without an accent. That's always going to be something that's going to be holding him back. What that means is he can't pretend to be one of us. Which, if you look at these immigrant actors who came over here and actually found some work, that's what they all do. Look at all the black immigrant actors who made it. All of them get on screen, and they've had to pretend to be us. Idris Elba, John Boyega, Chiwetel Ejiofor, Thandie Newton, David Oyelowo, and that last one, Oyelowo, he has literally made a damn career out of portraying black American historical figures, from the Tuskegee Airmen to Dr. King to Bass Reeves, and the word is he's plotting to play Joe Louis next. I'm not making that up. You know, come to think of it, David Oyelowo also complained about how he couldn't get any work in Britain, and he wasn't alone. In fact, lack of opportunity for roles happens to be the #1 problem that Afro-Britons complain about. But I would mention this. Afro-Britons are actually smaller in number than Asian Britons. That's important because you still see Afro-Britons in most British productions. Why is that the case? It is because of the all-pervasive nature of American media. American media has permeated and saturated the world, and it sets the frame for what much of the world thinks about when it comes to the entertainment that they put on air. And in the United States, it was the foundational black American community who fought to make sure that when these media companies were finally forced to have to put black people in front of the screens, we wanted to make sure that it was done the right way. No more of the step and fetch it stuff, no more degrading roles, and it was going to be on a regular basis. It wasn't going to be twos and fews. We kicked that door wide open, and because of the fact that American media saturates the world, this helped Afro-Britons, because even though they are smaller in number than other ethnic groups in Britain, because American media sets the frame for everybody else, they got to benefit from the fact that we were on screen so much. That made it where in Britain they looked and said, "Hey, we got ourselves a couple of darkies over here, maybe we should put them in front of the cameras. That's what those Yanks do, and they've been successful with it." That's a huge part of the story of Afro-British actors that doesn't get told. If they only got roles dependent on their actual percentage of the population, which is like 5% of the population over there, then they would have far fewer roles than they've got today. Their situation would be even worse. So truth be told, whether they want to admit it or not, they owe a huge debt of gratitude to the presence that black American actors established that actually gave them the opportunities that they have. And by the way, the Afro-British population of Britain are comprised of Caribbean immigrants from their former colonies and, of course, African immigrants from the same. These are the same individuals who, when they get to the United States, will call us lazy and say that we don't work hard, etc., etc. These are the same individuals who, when they're trying to get themselves a job in media, they're not talking about, well, why don't we try to appeal to the Nigerian American audience or appeal to the Jamaican American audience or the Caribbean American audience. They don't do that. They talk about Black Americans, specifically foundational Black Americans, and the reason why is our population is large enough to actually sustain an industry like that, to actually be an economic base. But secondly, and most importantly, foundational Black Americans actually support Black content creators with our money. You're not going to be able to have a business without that. You think that bootleg movies are a problem over here? You go to the Caribbean or to Africa, and it's bootleg mania out there. Nobody buys anything. They just make illegal copies of it and spread it around. It's impossible to make those places profitable because they don't support anything. See, this is part of what gets me. All this bragging that these immigrants do on themselves when in reality they run to white power for everything. And to them, that's a win. That's success. Now, at the individual level, a few of them might be able to get something. But group success is what's eluded them at home and here. We'll be talking about that later, but Djimon Hounsou's been in the U.S. for 3 decades at least now, and he's still struggling. What I want to know is, where are his countrymen at? Well, they're still acting like crabs in a bucket. There was a reason he had to come to the U.S. in the first place, because Africans refused to work together to build anything at home. Now compare that, on the other hand, to Black Americans in the U.S. Tyler Perry bought an old military base and he converted it into a full-fledged studio. 50 Cent also started a studio as well in Louisiana. Cat Williams is copying Tyler Perry, and he's bought a decommissioned military base in Alabama that he's going to convert into a studio. And word is that Anthony Mackie's down in New Orleans, having bought 20 acres and is planning to start a studio too. Now, compare that to Akon City, which is still scrub brush and tumbleweeds after damn near 10 years. But what I want to know is, what about these other groups who immigrate to the U.S. and who allegedly are outperforming Black Americans after 1 generation? That's the talking point du jour, isn't it? Well, I'm looking at Africa and the Caribbean, and I don't see any advancement there after 5 generations. These immigrants love to brag about how proud they are to be Nigerian or Sierra Leonean or wherever, but their home countries show them no love. And they show no love to home because they don't want to ever go back there. They all talk some pie-in-the-sky pipe dreams meant to save face. Idris Elba was making some loose talk about starting a studio in Zanzibar over the course of the next 10 years. Word is he's been allocated land for this project. Allocated? I wonder if that means that he bought it or the government decided to give it to him. Oh, well, I guess it doesn't matter, does it? Though those FBA men that I talked about, they bought the land for their studios. Nobody gave them anything. And while I'm not necessarily cheering for Idris Elba to fail, the problem is there's a reason that he's a unicorn out there. The Africans aren't trying to build anything at home. Again, I hope that he beats the odds, but in order for his plan to work, Africans are going to have to drop a lot of bad habits that they picked up over the centuries. For example, whatever happened to Nollywood? Anyone ever remember that old chestnut? Did that ever become anything? It seems every few years we hear about some low-budget or micro-budget indie flick coming out of Africa, and you get the usual flash-in-the-pan articles for one news cycle saying Africa's going to be starting a revolutionary film industry and is going to be the next big thing. But unfortunately, it always turns out to be a big nothing. This is not to dog out the immigrant family, especially not the ones who have been riders for us. It's to tell people to stop lying about the situation that you're in. Instead of saying thank you to the FBA family who made your opportunities possible, instead we got the tethers leading the charge to try to hide their embarrassment by insulting us and acting like they're setting the world on fire when the reality is the same internal failings that made them have to flee in the first place are still there. No amount of white media awards or movie roles is going to change a culture with a broken loyalty system. If someone's going to call themselves wagging their finger in our faces and claiming that their culture is superior to ours, then I don't think it's at all rude of us to look at the home of that culture where they are the most numerous and ask why it is that we don't see any of this quote-unquote success there. Fleeing, surrendering, giving up is now the culture in these places. It's not part of the culture. Unfortunately, it has become the culture. Last year, I told you about the word Japa. It's a Nigerian word that basically means to flee, and that this word was made into a music video by a guy named Naira Marley. Now, he's a Nigerian living in Britain. He's not living in Nigeria. He fled to Britain, and he was the guy who made an entire song about Japa. He put the word on the map. And Japa has basically become the core of youth culture in African societies. It's just a fact. And at the beginning of the video, he shows the definition of the word and what it means. Quote, "The act of escaping or avoiding someone or something, especially by way of trickery and Yoruba demon wits." Now, there's a few things we got to unpack here. One, it's the act of escaping, so that means fleeing. What are they escaping from? Their own country, the land they created. You know how people say that when you look at your home, you're seeing an externalization of your own mind? So if you have a messy home, that implies a messy mind. Well, the same thing is true at the macro level too. A messy country implies a messy culture that produced it. Japa also means to avoid something. Gee, what are they trying to avoid? They're trying to avoid putting in the hard work of cleaning up their home. They're not even fighting for their home. They don't want to clean it up or to even stand it back up on its feet. And here we get to the most important part of this guy's definition of Japa-ing, by way of trickery. Well, at least he's honest about that. When it comes time to flee, you tell whatever lie you have to tell, forge documents, claim political persecution, tell some 500-pound wildebeest of a female from Britain or the US that you love her, and as soon as she buys you that plane ticket, you're already plotting which family members you'll be staying with. But most of all, trickery to blend in with the native black population who's already there, to fly under the radar and try to attach their own opportunism to the other people's virtuous struggle. And finally, Yoruba demon wits. To me, what this means is they think they're avoiding their responsibilities and tricking people is clever. That's showing devilish wits as they see it. So to them, deception, trickery, running from the fight instead of plotting how to win the fight, to them, that's winning. Well, is that winning to us? And they continue to avoid and trick people when they get here. It doesn't stop. And this is what's permeated the youth culture not just of Nigeria, but much of the continent. This idea of built-in defeatism. Just go ahead and give up, run from home, don't even try to fight for anything. Where's the pride at? Where's the sense of dignity that people need just to be human? You know, I can't really fault this guy for truth in advertising. You have a Nigerian in Britain who's telling you exactly what Japa is, but he tries to make it look like he's doing some fly stuff, like he's slick for running away from home. In the video, he shows himself smoking weed, hanging around with white women, got bags of money, as if Japa is some sort of flex. That's the way that he's presenting it in his video. And this is why we have to draw a line between us and the tethers. Fleeing, avoiding putting in the work, trickery. This is a culture that's the opposite of ours, and it's what put Nigeria and the rest of Africa and the Caribbean in the terrible state they're in. This is why Pan-Africanism was always doomed to fail. We are ultimately incompatible. We're trying to repair the damage of the last 500 years, and you got the rest of the black world trying to escape fixing the damage at best and perpetuating it at worst. We're built differently. This isn't throwing shade or hating on people. We have hardcore B-1 soldiers from the Caribbean and Africa among us. But we have to be honest about the fact that their position was overrun a long time ago by the enemy within, which is the cowards and turncoats. Look at the definition of Japa. It's the ideology of the coward and the lazy and the whore who will sell themselves to anyone, and then turn around and spit in the faces of the people who open doors for them. Japa is the opposite of respect. It's the opposite of power. It's the opposite of black first. You want to glorify abandoning the fight? Glorify abandoning home? And what will you do when the enemy runs you out of your new would-be home? What will you do when you run out of places to flee to? Having practiced running from the enemy for hundreds of years, you're not going to suddenly discover your backbone later on. I'm sure we've all heard that for human beings, there's usually a fight or flee response that people give when confronted with a threat. But when the threat comes from other people, there is a third response that people give when fleeing is not an option. Getting on their knees and begging. See, when you run out of places to flee from and the enemy's got you on the run and they got you cornered, you haven't practiced how to fight, so what happens is if you can't flee, you have no choice but to beg. That's the reason why you got Asians who are coming into Africa and just straight ruling the place. But then again, they don't glorify escaping or avoiding or practicing trickery against each other. They punish people in their culture who do those things. When Japan was defeated after the Second World War, they didn't abandon home. They rebuilt it. The Chinese didn't abandon home after the Maoist Revolution either. They built it up. Same for Korea and Vietnam. And that's why they're respected. They didn't want pity. They wanted power on their own terms and in their own land. That's why you have Nigerians and others trying to get into those Asian countries, and these places have begun to put certain limitations on that. Pan-Africanism is about making Africa the center of the world. Problem is, it was only black people in the United States who actually believed in that concept. And we see the same sad situation in Haiti, and recently a state of emergency has been declared in Trinidad and Tobago. So all of these places where the tethers were coming from and wagging their fingers at us, the situation's getting worse there. And this is the natural result. It was never going to turn out any other way. This is important because in the US, we saw an absolute explosion of violence in the inner city as immigration restrictions were lifted in the 60s. This was largely, not entirely, but we have to stop sugarcoating it, this was largely a result of people coming here from places where block wars are the norm and started to do that stuff here. From the end of chattel slavery until the end of the civil rights movement, you never had FBAs doing block wars. Only large-scale fighting that you saw were the racial conflicts where we were defending ourselves from white supremacist aggression. But the practice of black people arming themselves to kill other black peoples in the streets, that didn't happen here until the late 60s. And in case anyone wants to doubt that, please tell me why in Jamaica, Haiti, and all the rest of those islands we've seen this pattern and it continues to the present. You see, there's no black Americans there except for a handful of tourists. Are they the ones to blame for the widespread violence in those places? Is there some huge influx of gangbangers from the proverbial south side of Chicago who have invaded Trinidad and Tobago that I didn't hear about? Are drug dealers from south central LA responsible for what's going on in Haiti? Was it the so-called lazy black people in the US who turned Nigeria into a place that they all want to flee from? This was why I and so many others stopped talking about Pan-African anything. Many of our mentors were dedicated to that idea because they realized that the best way to fight a global system of white supremacy was with a united black front. But you can't unify with people who don't want to unify amongst themselves. And sadly, most people from the continent and the islands are content to live a lie, to run away from and escape and avoid the reality and then trick themselves into thinking this is witty and clever. That's why Brother Tariq posted that video a while back of some tether bragging that of course she wasn't going to unite with FBAs because she didn't come to build, she came to take. When people tell you who they are, believe them. Trickery is just another word for deception. I've often quoted a scene from the movie The Departed where Martin Sheen says, "We practice deception here, but what we don't practice is self-deception." That's why when these white supremacists carry out their lies and deception and trickery, it results in empowerment for them because they don't make it a habit to trick and avoid and deceive each other. The enemy has a code. Yes, it's a dirty, filthy, racist caveman code, but it is consistent, and most of the time, they enforce it. Their code is built around the principle of acquiring and accumulating power and then guarding it as a group. This is why they demonize black people relentlessly. This is a crucial component to how they condition the dominant society to take up a bunker mentality, to keep the guns pointed outside towards black people and not at one another. Without us, what you see happening in Ukraine would be far worse. In the US, Scotland, England, and Ireland still don't like each other. They had that Scottish referendum several years ago to break away from the UK, and the measure only failed by a few percentage points. And of course there's Brexit, which shows that all that talk about Britain being part of Europe was just hot air. Yes, the white powers that be have disciplined their ranks to have an us versus them mentality and using black people as the focus for this distraction from their own internal hostility. They tricked everyone, but as the old saying goes, you can't fool all the people all the time. As the black grassroots, not just in the US but around the world, we are a minority within a minority. True, but we stand for reality and truth, but most of all, we stand. We don't escape or avoid or flee. We're 10 toes down in this fight. That's why we're respected. Not liked, but respected. Because that which you cannot defeat, you must accept. We don't care about being liked. Power is not a popularity contest. And besides, the only way people like us is on our knees, and we're not doing that. That may be good enough for everybody else, but it's damn sure not good enough for us. The Africans have been trying to avoid the tough choice that they have to make. They have to decide whether they're willing to pay the price that power demands. They think that they can get it on the cheap. That's what they've been trying to do with us in the United States, telling us to fight for their power. They think they can get somebody else to pay the bill, and the real world doesn't work like that. That's why you see these places in turmoil. They have a broken loyalty system. They idolize their oppressors and hate what they see in the mirror. This is how they can beg for our help to get into the US, but when they get here, spit in our faces and immediately make common cause with white supremacy. I don't want to hear about any Africans who built businesses in the United States and then you talk as if they make some sort of big deal in Africa when all they do is usually build themselves a summer home there where they take their white wives. That's not a flex. And beyond that, you never see these immigrants uniting amongst one another. Sure, they'll talk about immigrants in general, but when they use that word, they're talking about themselves specifically, not immigrants from anywhere else. When they immigrate to other countries, they almost never have anything to do with other immigrants, even those from Africa or the Caribbean. And it never occurred to them that this absolute refusal to unite with and be loyal to one another is exactly the reason they had to flee in the first place. When Africans celebrate fleeing as some sort of come-up, that is not some victimless crime. To themselves, they've defined fleeing from home as winning, when in reality it's an admission that they're totally defeated. You can't let the thieves and thugs take over home when, if you just unite against them, you could overrun them all. The problem is not the corruption of these governments, it's the collective cowardice of the citizenry. That may be a harsh reality, but it is the reality. The world is watching Africa, and they're licking their chops as they see the continent with the bulk of the world's mineral reserves, minerals that the industrialized world is helplessly dependent on for their technology and their dominance, is being abandoned by its inhabitants. Africa could and should be the gatekeepers for which countries are allowed to industrialize and which ones don't, because without Africa's minerals, these first world countries would see their technological advancement slam to a crawl, while other countries would be able to catch up to them and overtake them easily. In other words, Africa is in a position to do something that only white power has done for the last few hundred years. Choose who the winners and losers are going to be. But right now it seems they've chosen to make themselves the losers. And to these colonists from the US, Europe, and Asia, that means they can just walk in and take it all without firing a single shot, which is exactly what they've been doing. Africa is allowing foreigners to slice the continent up and divide it amongst themselves, except this time the foreigners aren't looking for slaves. They're looking for the land and its resources. So it's in their interest that the people be gone altogether, but they're not looking to let the Africans set up shop in their countries. And what is the Africans' response to this existential crisis? To flee, and when they get to the U.S., to get into some kind of asinine mudslinging contest against us. To try to make themselves feel better about having to flee by telling lies about how they're quote-unquote doing better than us. They have now Japa'd from themselves. They're avoiding and fleeing from and tricking themselves. So the Africans need to figure out if they're going to continue trying to escape and avoid their responsibilities and trick themselves into believing that they're winning, or if at long last the Africans and the Caribbean peoples are finally prepared to stand for a change. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Liban Gurhan, Turk McKenzie, Sean, Omar, and Glenda Tice. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.